Every morning, the team at The Exchange meets to discuss the top stories of the day. Here's a look at what we think makes the cut.
Canada does not have a hot housing market. Those three cities have a hot housing market.
Twitter 1 year later?
They're inevitably going to be pushed to either monetize or grow, and there's not a lot of room left to grow.
I can imagine sports fans saying, oh, I don't like that. I cannot imagine a single sports fan no longer watching that sport because there are ads.
Twitter, the public company, turned one today. Since its $45 IPO last November, the company's stock has had some big ups and downs. It hit a high of $73 in December and a low of $30 in May. It's down 10% over the year. Some of the swings come from Twitter's user growth gaining and then losing momentum. It added 13 million monthly active users in the most recent quarter, an increase of 4.8%. That's slower growth than the quarter before, though. Active users were up 6.3% then. Whether the company likes it or not, it gets compared to Facebook. In the most recent quarter, Facebook added 30 million active users. It now has a total of 1.3 billion. Twitter has 284 million active users. Some think Twitter still has a lot of room to grow, though. One analyst at Cantor Fitzgerald said Twitter continues to be under-monetized relative to peers. Another analyst at Canaccord said Twitter is early in monetizing its very large and growing user base. We look at volatility more as an opportunity. In our meeting, we discussed Twitter's struggle to take off as a public company.
The difficulty of doing this once you're a public company is you have to hit your quarterly figure. And that is what's going to drive the stock unless you're Amazon.
You know, it still feels like it's at that stage in the social network where Mark Zuckerberg is saying, we don't know what it is yet, we can't monetize it. Twitter's still trying to figure that out. They're further down the road, but not that much.
I'm going to think about the Google IPO. Where were they a year later? Well, it was higher.
Well, yeah.
Facebook IPO, weak start, but where were they a year later? Higher. This is
There are lots of tech
bucking that
examples that
trend.
weren't, though. Zynga, I mean, you don't really want to be compared to Zynga.
That's just it.
That's the point, isn't it?
House prices in 3 of Canada's major urban centres are growing at a faster pace than the rest of the country. Prices in Toronto, Calgary and Vancouver combined have increased 83% over the last 10 years. The data crunchers behind the numbers point out that while those markets are extremely strong, it accounts for just 1/4 of the market. It explained that 75% of the Canadian market follows a different trend line. Prices are up 60% over the past decade in the rest of Canada. Dig deeper into specific neighborhoods and you can really see where the growth is coming from. In Killarney, a residential part of Calgary, house prices rose 39% over the past 5 years. House prices in the Willowdale neighborhood of Toronto surged 90% over that same period. In Dunbar, a neighborhood in Vancouver, prices increased 104%. There are high-growth areas outside of those major centres as well. In Westmount, one of Montreal's ritzier areas, house prices jumped 64% over the last 5 years. In our meeting, we questioned whether the neighborhoods that aren't experiencing an extreme rise in prices would be spared if prices collapsed.
Does this mean it's not as much of a danger of a housing crash that could seriously affect the economy? I mean, those
No.
are 3 large cities.
I wouldn't want our viewers to get the impression that it means if you don't live in those cities that you're isolated from a downturn in housing, because it's not like if those cities didn't crash that the rest of the country wouldn't be affected by it.
Sponsorships are big business for the NHL. The league made about $400 million from them last season. Now it's looking to give a boost to that line on the balance sheet. The NHL is eyeing players' jerseys as new ad space. COO John Collins said in a recent interview that jersey sponsorship is both coming and happening. It may come as a shock to fans that are used to pristine, strictly team-focused jerseys. The NHL recently allowed practice jerseys to sport some unobtrusive logos, while other sports already cash in on regular uniforms real estate. Soccer jerseys are one example. They have both company names and logos. The fear of NHL fans may be that players' jerseys could end up looking like NASCAR drivers, a collage of colorful ads and logos. In our meeting, we discussed whether the in-your-face advertising would hurt or help the NHL's brand.
And as a fan, I don't really like more reminders that it's a business. I mean, I'm not naive to know that wouldn't happen.
I don't understand why they don't do this already. Soccer's the most popular sport in the world, and it certainly hasn't turned any fans off there.
If it ends up being like a NASCAR jumpsuit, then fans will have a problem with that.
There could be a disparity between the haves and the have-nots because the Toronto Maple Leafs do not need to put the ads on, so they
Well, that's the thing,
might
this-
not have to.
I do think the one loser might be the branding of a team, because I think it really does water down the branding of a team.
Look at the other stuff that they sell with their brand all over it. Like, are they really that concerned? You could get a pair of Leafs women's wedges on the NHL website.
Oh, come on, that's
Polka dot
classy.
posters.
That's super classy.
What are the chances if they, all of a sudden hockey players are plastered from head to toe in advertising, that it's not going to cost me $650 to take a family of 4 to see the Leafs play? That it might
You
cost
live in the wrong
$350.
country if you're looking for cheap pro hockey.
For more on the potential benefits or fan fallout of putting ads on NHL jerseys, we go to Robert Boland. He's a professor of sports management at New York University. So, Robert, as we mentioned, there is a little bit of advertising on the jerseys right now. Potentially a lot more room, and maybe a lot more room for money making. How much could this be worth to the NHL?
This is a really difficult question, because on some level, the thing that separates American or North American sports teams from European teams is that for the history of North American sports, our logos and our club logos have been the thing that's been featured most prominently and are one of the most valuable pieces of intellectual property attached to any club. That's not true of almost any of the major European clubs in soccer or any other sport for that matter. Sometimes color scheme, but almost never the entire space of the uniform with a logo or any branding. So I'm not sure that this, from a pure marketing perspective, I'm not sure this adds any value, particularly when you start to add up the value proposition of what it might detract from some of the great logos, particularly the original 6 teams in the NHL.
Well, it adds raw cash to the bottom line of the NHL if they can sell, space on the helmet, on the gloves, on the jersey. Although most people are saying they think that if the league was to introduce this, they would do it in a fairly graduated way, bit by bit, and it would not be as in your face as the NASCAR sort of thing. Do you think that any amount of increase in this sort of advertising is going to damage the NHL's brand?
We've been hearing for years that this is coming both in basketball and hockey and then in other sports, and certainly the sports, when they're outside the United States, have experimented with it in certain cases, and particularly Major League Baseball when they've played in Japan or Australia. But so far they've left it alone. I think the other challenge of looking at this idea is the places, and I think your War Room talked about it a little bit, the places where it would be most important, it would also have the greatest damaging factor. It would take some of the power away from the Montreal Canadiens crest. It would take some of the power away from the Maple Leafs leaf. And in the places where the uniform isn't historic or particularly unique, expansion teams, even Vancouver, which has changed its uniform pretty much with the wind, I don't know if the revenue would be worth it either. So. And the other thing, this would be completely local revenue. I don't think you could get one sponsor for all the league's jerseys, so you would see great disparities in what would come into teams, and it would be a choice of an individual owner to do it or not do it. And that's where this becomes a lot more fraught with problem. Now, could you feature jersey space from a naming rights sponsor on an arena or some of the other opportunities? Yeah, but I think there are just more valuable opportunities advertising in and around a rink or in and around a stadium without potentially alienating people to desecrate the jersey. But if you're talking about pure money, there's no reason why it hasn't happened other than the value of our jerseys and sweaters are particularly important.
I mean, you heard the question asked in our meeting there, is any fan going to stop watching because there's more logos? And I think that's a fair question.
I don't think a single fan will stop watching because of more logos. We've certainly experienced an era of logo creep in almost every sport and almost everything we do, and viewership is at an all-time high. But it could affect the desire of fans to buy new jerseys. It could affect the desire of fans to deal with certain products or boycott certain products if they're unhappy about it. And it also does reflect back on the team the same way a naming rights deal gone bad can. If you put a company that does something wrong on your jersey, that's a challenge for you then from a marketing and PR perspective as well. So this is not an unbumpy road to talk about, or it is a bumpy road to talk about it that way. And I think that's one of the reasons why the North American teams and leagues who've talked about this for quite a while and would do almost anything they can to make an extra dollar here north of the border or south of the border have stayed away from this so far.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I'm curious if you know anything about the timing here. Why would this make any sense to be talking about it now? Because earlier, just a couple months ago actually, there were some reports from sources saying that the NHL had been looking at this, but that it didn't want to be the first North American league to go down this route, that it was perhaps waiting for the NBA to be a little more aggressive in terms of the advertising it was putting out there, and was holding off. But now, here we are, we're hearing this interview with the chief operating officer saying, yes, oh yes, it's coming, it's happening right now. So I'm curious what you see could be behind that, of why they're moving even more aggressively than apparently what they originally intended to do.
Well, this is about the time, if you're going to sign a deal for next year, you probably would sign it or announce it. So it probably means there is probably a club or two interested in shopping a deal like this, and the NBA may already have one coming. Again, I think you're going to see this on a much more ad hoc basis in the North American leagues as opposed to in Europe, where everyone does it to some degree. But again, I think the history of the uniform and the history of the logos in Europe are so much less, even to the point that Manchester United, probably the best known brand, was still wearing a plain red jersey into the 1970s, when no North American team would have ever done something like that. So I think you may see a deal or two of this like this pop up, but I don't think it'll be universal, and I do think that the timing is right for the next league cycle, and maybe we'll see if there is something to make it worthwhile. So it could have been a shopping proposition, I think, from Mr. Collins.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.